Hey, me again. This is part two of LGBTQ Americans. Um, one thing I forgot to mention, I shared a link in our Blackboard content folder that you can look at with regard to AIDS activism in the 1980s. It's very informative and that might be of interest if you're interested in looking at it. Um, today, the, the sad to say, not want to single out a certain political party, but the Republican Party in the United States, many Republican politicians and others on the far right today in the United States continue to continuously oppose federal legislative protections against discrimination for LGBTQ folk in housing, employment, etc. Right. However, there have been some successes that the book mentions. One was a Supreme Court ruling in 2013, Lawrence, in the case of Lawrence v. Texas, where decriminalization of sodomy was declared decriminalized. It was There used to be, you could basically arrest someone for being gay under these laws in some states, right? That still have these laws on the books. Um, Another one was basically allowing LGBTQ people to um, uh, serve openly in the military. At a time, you could be discharged with a dishonorable discharge for being gay or lesbian. Um, and then we had this "don't ask, don't tell" policy that if you didn't talk about it, then your job would be safe and you would be discharged. But then that was ended and said you can serve openly in the military. This has been there recently in our country. This is not a book, but recently in our country, the Trump administration has decided to winnow away at protections against LGBTQ people in the military, particularly against trans and queer folk, um, which is pretty pathetic. But anyway, so also in 2015, the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges that the denial of marriage to same-sex couples violated the 14th Amendment, particularly the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So that was one success in the LGBTQ community as well, right? Generally, since I was younger, and I do believe this is to be true, just based on my observations and everything, um, the book mentions that public attitudes. There has been an increasing tolerance and acceptance of LGBTQ folk in recent decades, and this does seem to be true. Although there's still we see differences in levels of tolerance based on religious affiliation sometimes, and on cultural norms. Particularly those who might come from cultures and countries in which tolerance of LGBTQ folk is very low. That might affect their perceptions of LGBTQ folk once they're in the United States. The book also mentions within the African American community, there's kind of a dichotomy. Some be it due to perhaps religious influences and sometimes age, there may be less acceptance within the black community. However, many black activists today see definite parallels between what they historically experienced and discrimination that affect LGBTQ people today. In particular, Julian Bond, before he died, I saw an interview with him on TV wherein he talked about how he was a former head of the NAACP, and he talked about how LGBTQ rights was the new civil rights movement in the United States, and this was just a few years ago before he died. He mentioned this, and it's so many people, are allies of the LGBTQ community and other activist communities, talking about the shared experience of discrimination, marginalization, oppression, and violence against them, right? So acceptance for LGBTQ people may vary with age. Younger folk tend to be a little bit more tolerant than older Americans. We talked about the contact hypothesis. This may, from the interactionist view, um, this may have to do with the fact that the more LGBTQ people are visible, the more people know LGBTQ people, and the more tolerant people become because of the people they know. So this intergroup contact hypothesis may play a role here, perhaps. With people we know in our families and friends and at work and stuff like that. So that may play a factor, perhaps, because of the visibility of more LGBTQ people, right? So there's, I mentioned before, there's a wide range with regard to sexuality, sexual orientation, um, uh, identity, gender identity, that's part of a continuum. So we really don't know how many LGBTQ people really exist. We don't know. We used to rely on a study called the Kinsey study that said that 1 out of 10 people were gay, right? It's quite probable that these numbers are actually lower, but we don't know. And I'm not sure that it really matters. But because you could be like married to a woman and be gay. You could be have a same-sex encounter, sexual encounter, and be straight. So it's like, how do you quantify these things, or how do you categorize these things and fit people into a box? It's very hard to do that, right? With regard to current LGBTQ issues, hate crimes is a big issue, right? In particular, the book mentions one particular hate crime that was pretty horrific. Not to, say one hate crime is worse than another, but there was a case of Matthew Shepard, who was a young man in Wyoming who was beaten to death, right? And out of this led to the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Protection Act. James Byrd Jr. actually was a black man who was lynched. And so this federal act gave federal protection for hate crimes and enhanced penalties for violent crimes motivated by animus toward a group based on race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. Right? Book also mentions issues with gay parenting. How some are still opposed to that because of deeply held prejudices based on the supposed immorality of homosexuality. How this pervasive idea that gays and lesbians are believed to be child molesters, and how gender identity for the child could be confused growing up. They might grow up gay or be confused about gender roles. Quantitative research shows that this is false. Empirical research shows that all this is false, but there are still laws excluding same-sex couples from adopting or becoming parents in several states still in the United States until a federal ruling in 2016 to be unconstitutional, and the Trump administration is trying to bring back exemptions for this, unfortunately, right? Today, where some of the most important activism is happening is with regard to trans and queer rights, right? One thing I want to mention is that the book mentions the terminology biological sex. Okay, there's no such thing. It's more accurate to talk about assigned sex to the sex we were assigned at birth, right? Because of our genitalia at that time, right? So there's no such thing as biological sex. Sex on a biological basis, even chromosomally or even with genitalia, sometimes there's variations with that as well. So it's hard to talk about biological sex. It's not really accurate, right? But anyway, so I wanted to mention that before I continue because that's not really correct what Perillo said in the book, right? So some present issues are basically for trans and queer people are persistent and pervasive discrimination. Trans people are not federally protected from housing and employment discrimination in the United States. They are more marginalized in society. Particularly those of color, and violence, particularly against trans women of color, has increased over the last several years, in particular the last 3 years, right? There's also been very public debate about public access to public restrooms. The use of public restrooms corresponding to one's gender identity instead of the gender one was assigned at birth, right? Issues with regard to health care, how gender reassignment usually is not covered by insurance. It's considered an elective surgery. And of course, the Trump administration also, their ban on trans folk enlisting and are continuing to serve in the military. There are some active federal court cases challenging this ban. But that is unfortunate, to say the least. There's some stuff I wanted to mention that's not in our book with regard to other issues and indicators, particularly sociological indicators with regard to LGBTQ people. Certain issues and problems disproportionately affect LGBTQ Americans, particularly trans and queer people. There's a higher incidence of homelessness among LGBTQ youth, higher incidence of drug and alcohol abuse, higher rates of suicide for youth, higher rates for sex work, often linked to being kicked out of your house and being homeless. You oftentimes, right, not being hired by employers because you're trans or queer, right? There are higher trans and queer folk in particular, but LGBTQ folk as well in general suffer from higher rates of incarceration, particularly non-white trans queer people. And also another indicator, another health consequence is higher rates of depression and anxiety among LGBTQ folk, right? The book next mentions looking at LGBTQ people through the sociological analyses, the three views that we use: the functionalist view, conflict view, interactionist view, right? So when we talk about the functionalist view, we're really talking about basically how homosexuality and trans and queer people in general used to be seen as very disruptive to the smooth functioning of society because it was believed to undermine the institution of marriage and stability of the family unit, and very transgressive and deviant because they ran counter to traditional, clearly defined gender norms in society. So that's why laws were put into place to criminalize such behavior and identities, right? So a solution from the functionalist view would be the same thing kind of like we discussed with women as a minority group. If we redefine gender roles and proper gender behavior, what is acceptable, that would overcome the dysfunction in society, right? And not making LGBTQ people change something that they really may not be able to change, right? So if we look at the conflict view, this view would be best served by looking at the ways in which LGBTQ people have been treated with hostility, marginalization, discrimination, and violence in society, denial of fair treatment, unequal opportunity, and protection under the law. So we're talking about power relations, right? Exactly, from dominant society. And again, asking this question, who benefits from this, right? So ask yourself that question, right? So it has only been through LGBTQ activism that has challenged discriminatory laws and the status quo. So some groups have gained political power through their activism and direct action and has lobbied for change in discriminatory laws, and which has been great, right? With regard to interactionist view, one way to look at it is through what are called sexual scripts, right? These sexual scripts, when we talk about sexual scripts, we're talking about enactments of complex sets of cultural meanings, sort of the normative cultural context that gives sex and gender its meaning, right? So when LGBTQ people go against these scripts that we have in our minds, right, this leads to what's called labeling theory, a perspective addressing how others' categorizations affect one's self-identity and behavior, right? And we talked about labeling theory before, right? And we learn social behavior and interactions with other people. So through these interactions, we form self-concepts about being LGBTQ. So LGBTQ people may internalize society's society's concepts of them with negative consequences. Some of the consequences we talked about, right? So the focus from an interactionist view would be to change society's attitudes, right? And contact hypothesis may help in this respect, right? So I have time on this video? Very briefly. So what you're going to do for your assignment this week is you're going to watch a documentary called The T Word. Hosted, you'll see Laverne Cox in there from Orange is the New Black. She is a trans woman activist and actress, right? And so you'll view that video, and then your discussion question will be like some of the challenges that trans and queer folk, particularly youth, face in our society today. So that's it. So enjoy the documentary, and I look forward to listening or reading your discussion board posts. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Bye.